Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Just Teach Ministries. My name is Charlton, and today we have an exciting study coming out of Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. The title of this discussion is Lord of the Sabbath. So the story goes that a young student pondered the question: is it more ethical to follow the letter of the law or the spirit of the law, particularly when the two are in conflict with each other? To seek the answer to this question, the student sought out three people. The student first sought out a theologian, a person trained in spiritual and philosophical aspects of morality. The theologian smiled, and he told the young student that it was all about the letter of the law. We must recognize that there is a higher power that guides our lives. That higher power wants what's best for us, and there are strict rules given that there are strict rules that are given that should guide our lives unto salvation. Not particularly feeling this answer was the right one, the student went to a well-known philosopher. Hearing the question, the philosopher pondered the answer for a bit and then he spoke. He said, "It is the spirit of the law." The philosopher began. It says, "By understanding the deeper meaning of life and the nuances of morality, we can better understand the right choices." Still not satisfied with that answer, the student goes to a local lawyer and asks the question: which is better, to follow the letter of the law or the spirit of the law? Without hesitation, the attorney spoke and he said, "For $500, I can make the answer anything you want." So our lesson today is about Lord of the Sabbath. And while Jesus is not a lawyer, he can certainly make the Sabbath whatever he wants. And I thought that story was pretty comical and a great segue into this conversation. So as we make our way into today's lesson, listen, as always, I want to invite you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to the Just Teach Ministries YouTube platform. Click the all notifications bell. We do cover 3 Sunday school curriculums on this platform currently. If you click the all notifications bell, you will be notified when those lessons are available to you. Also, I want to invite you to visit us at justteachministries.com. We provide lesson notes with each video that we upload, the same notes that we use to do these presentations. So I think there's about 5 pages for this lesson. So definitely full of great information. So make your way and download those and add them to your study materials, presentation materials, however that works. There's a link in the description of this video, and also there'll be a link at the top of the comment section. So let's do this. As we make our way into today's lesson, let's establish a lesson background and context. I have a few observations that I want to make related to Matthew chapter 12. Now, please understand, at this point in Jesus's ministry, Jesus is already beginning to experience some level of opposition. He's already ready to experience some people that are antagonists of his ministry, particularly like the Pharisees and the spiritual leaders at this day. Why is that? Well, for several reasons. Number one, because Jesus taught as one having authority, as Luke would point out in Luke chapter number 4. Not only that, but Jesus would perform miracles, which made him a very influential person. And then also Jesus didn't readily, participate in all of the rabbinical teachings that some of the Pharisees would try to teach and maybe impose on other people. These are not necessarily rules that are readily explained or articulated or related to the Mosaic law. These are rules that are elevated, above and aside from the Mosaic law, not related to salvation. And because Jesus didn't participate in these rules, it seemed to kind of impede on the influence of the Pharisees, and they didn't like that. They like being seen as the religious elite. They like being seen as the most pious. They like being seen as the things that they're doing as necessary. And when Jesus didn't do these things, but he still operated in power and influence and authority, they weren't a huge fan of that. So Jesus didn't seem to, quote unquote, toe the line. So you would read places like in Matthew 9:3, where it says, and behold, certain the scribes said within themselves, this man blasphemeth. That's after Jesus had healed a man And he said, your sins be forgiven. And they were like, well, how does he have the power to forgive sin? And of course, Jesus was speaking to his deity. And then Matthew 9:34, it says, but the Pharisees says he casteth out devils through the prince of the devils. They were saying that he operate in the name of Beelzebub. So in a sense, they were saying like, this guy's a devil. He's operating under witchcraft and demonic influence and different things like that. So they were saying all these things, of course, to try to present themselves as hindrances and stumbling blocks to Jesus's ministry. And certainly here in Matthew chapter 12, we're getting ready to witness, Jesus. It's an interaction that happened with the disciples on the Sabbath. There's another healing that takes place on a Sabbath as well. That's usually written in conjunction with this, not necessarily on the same day. But what we're seeing is activities that are being done on the Sabbath, and it is presenting itself again as opposition. And there's some discussions and some issues going around with the Pharisees. So today, when we're talking about the Sabbath, I want you to understand that there are the Sabbath is the fourth commandment, of course, of the 10 commandments, and there are certain stipulations that are related to the Sabbath. I'm not trying to certainly in order to understand that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, you want to understand what the Sabbath is, and it is articulated in Exodus chapter 20 verses 8 through 11, and then Deuteronomy chapter 5 verses 12 through 15. And when you read this commandment, there are certain words that stick out to you, like remember, holy, blessed, hallowed, all of these words are used to describe the Sabbath. And God gave instructions for how do you remember, or how do you honor the holiness or the hallowedness or the blessedness of the Sabbath. Well, what you do is you rest. That means that you cease from labor. That means that you don't do any work. Now, to understand that, you have to define work, because work is just simply something that you do for an occupation. It's something that is done for income. You do not work. And I think that that's important, because when we start to unpack the criticism and the accusations of the Pharisees, you're going to realize that they are elevating this concept of work way beyond just something simple as what you do for a living. If you look at the most Orthodox Jews in practicing Shabbat on the day of preparation, they do things like lighting candles. Why? Because lighting candles is seen as work. So there is, and of course, that is something that is an elevation from rabbinical teachings that go beyond just what the Mosaic law sought to teach as far as reverencing the Sabbath day. So there are some guidelines related to the Sabbath that are other places in the Mosaic law. You would read about really in Exodus chapter 16, how traveling certain distances were prohibited. So there was a guideline that was set up again by the rabbis. That was something that's called like a Sabbath day's journey, which is roughly like 1.5 miles or so. If you travel too far on the Sabbath, it's considered work. And then there's also, you would read about really in Jeremiah chapter 17 about carrying heavy loads. So it's interesting to consider that while these things aren't necessarily work, they might be so laborious in nature that they might resemble work, and that it gives room to say things like, okay, well, let's say you're cutting your grass. Cutting your grass may not be something you do for a living, but it may be something that somebody does for a living, and that could be considered work. So for people, even New Testament believers, that in their heart they really want to honor and reverence the Sabbath, they might say things like, well, I'm going to, not do things like cut the grass, or do things that might resemble work. I'm going to take the time and effectively rest. And that's a personal choice. But there is guidelines. There is, and when I say guidelines, there's scripture that can kind of guide your thinking in that. You can kind of decide and figure out for yourself, what is appropriate for rest. But it's very clear that working is what you do for a living. So with that, there are 4 quick principles that I want to highlight as it relates to the Sabbath. Number 1 is that the Sabbath is for man's benefit, and it is a gift, and it is an expression of faith. Jesus was saying in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, it says that the Sabbath is made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And I think that that is very important, because the idea of honoring the Sabbath and keeping it holy, it was not supposed to be something that was so laborious that your activity in reverencing the Sabbath became work. No, Jesus is saying the Sabbath wasn't meant to be a new form of work or to be laborious, but it was meant to be a gift. It was meant to be something that you could sit back and rest, and allow your mind to recoup, allow your spirit to recoup, allow your body to recoup. And it is indeed an expression of faith. Why? Well, because in ancient times, and even I would say particularly in contemporary culture, working 7 days a week is much less an expectation. And by you taking a day off, you're in a sense, you are sowing that day. It is an expression of faith to saying, look, I'm not going to work as much as these other people, but I'm going to take the time and rest and accept this gift that God has given me. And I'm going to trust that God is going to allow the work that I've done in the 6 days to give me the necessary benefit that I need in order to take care of myself and my loved ones. So the Sabbath is for man's benefit. Other thing I want to point out is, of course, is that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, which is right in line with today's lesson. So we're definitely going to vet out this concept and develop it quite a bit. But the one thing I want you to understand, that if Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, that means that he has authority and that he is the provider of the Sabbath. I think that that is very, very important. So him having authority means that he gives guidelines, that he gives instruction, that he is the one that has the ability to dictate, but then also he provides rest. That means that we find rest in him. Jesus is our rest. And that concept is very thoroughly fleshed out in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1-11. But then also it is more concisely mentioned in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 and 29, where it says, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn of me, for I am meek and lowly of heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. So Jesus, speaking to a Jewish audience, talking about resting in him, he's essentially saying, you may be most familiar with doing external works to prove that you are covenant people, but Jesus is saying, I have done all the necessary work. In me is the finished work. In me is salvation. So by you resting in me and having faith in the work that I've done, you can find rest for your souls. You can find salvation in me. So I think that, that is a very important principle when we talk about Jesus as Lord of the Sabbath, and the fact that he has authority and we find rest in him. Number 3, quickly, and I'm moving. It says that the Sabbath is helpful for deeds, and the omission of which would be evil. It is for helpful deeds. Excuse me. It is for helpful deeds. What am I saying? That it's okay to do work if it's in the name of helping somebody. If somebody's stranded on the side of the road because their car's broke down, or somebody's tire needs to be changed, like, yes, that is work. And if it happens on the Sabbath, don't pass them by and leave them stranded, be like, oh no, I can't change it. We got to wait until the day after the Sabbath. No, Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath. And one of the accusations from the Pharisees is like, well, by you healing him, you're doing work. And Jesus said in a very theological way, I'm going to say it in more common terms, but he's just saying, like, would it be right for me to just leave the man, sick? It's right to do right, even if it's on the Sabbath, even if it requires you to do work. And then the fourth thing I want to point out is that the Father works even on the Sabbath, so does the Son of Man. And so essentially what Jesus is saying, that the way that I operate, the power that I operate under and through, is power that is given to me by the Father, which means that the Father's at work through me. So if the Father's working, then I'm working as well. So these 4 principles are just general Sabbath principles that I think are consistent with the ministry of Jesus. But of course, number 2 is the one that we're probably going to more heavily lean on over the course of this lesson. So let's do this. Matthew chapter 12, verse number 1. Let's begin to unpack this powerful text. Scripture reads, it says, at the time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungered. and began to pluck the ears of corn and did eat. You might want to highlight or pay attention to that word hunger. Why? Well, because Matthew is the only gospel writer to use that word. Of course, this account was written in the book of Mark. It was written in the book of Luke. You know, the three synoptic gospels, synoptic being same. They all gave an account of this particular interaction with Jesus and the Pharisees, but Matthew is the only one to highlight the fact that the disciples were hungry, and that was the motivation for them plucking these ears of corn. Now, of course, we want to highlight the fact that the disciples were not stealing. The Jews, being a group of people that had a community responsibility, very, very, very generous people, and even to this day. And that is something that I have to say that I deeply admire about Jews is their spirit of community. You know, this is really what the issue was elevated in Acts chapter 6, where it talked about that the widows did not have provisions, and how, you know, the first church wanted to establish individuals who would be responsible for collecting means for these widows. But that concept is not new. It wasn't new to Acts chapter 6. Really, if you would go back to the Mosaic law in places like Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 24 through 25, it talked about that your neighbor was allowed to come to your vineyard, and if they were hungry, they could glean in order to fill themselves for their own pleasure. Now, of course, it stipulated that they could not use a sickle, which means they couldn't go around with an instrument and start harvesting and, you know, reaping from your vineyard. But if they were walking through and they were hungry, the Mosaic law permitted them to partake of your field. So this is more or less what Matthew would be highlighting and saying, like, yeah, that what they're doing falls in line with the Mosaic law. They're not stealing. And then, of course, there were other elements of the Mosaic law that spoke to the community responsibility of Israel. In Deuteronomy 24:19, it talked about when you cut down your harvest and you leave a sheaf in the field, don't go back and get it, but you should leave it for the fatherless and the widow. And then, of course, Leviticus 23:22, it talks about when you reap your harvest to leave the four corners unharvested, again, leaving that for the poor and the stranger and different things like that. So there is built into the Mosaic law this community responsibility. And that is more or less what the disciples are leaning on right here. They're like, man, it's the Sabbath and we're hungry. Let's pluck these ears of corn so we can eat. Okay, so what is the Pharisees' response to this? What is their accusation? It says, but when the Pharisees saw it, it says, they said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. Now, you can already tell this conversation has an agenda. You can already tell that these are loaded accusations, loaded responses. Why? Because it's the disciples are the ones that pluck the corn, but they're directing all their conversation to Jesus. Because why? Because that's their target. That's who they're really after. And they're trying to say, well, these are your disciples and they're doing it. Well, you're responsible for them. And how many of y'all know that salvation doesn't work like that? You know, your pastor can preach to your pastor is blue in the face, but if you decide you don't want to live right, that's between you and God. That's you and God on the judgment day. You can't stand before God and say, well, my pastor said this and my pastor said that. No, God's going to be like, no, your pastor has to live his own life. But you got to live yours. And the Pharisees, of course, they're not being spiritual in this. They're being very fleshly. They're being accusatory, but it's challenging because of who this accusation is coming from. Because understand this, I know we cast a lot of negative light on the Pharisees, really, as New Testament believers, as Christians. But in biblical times, they were very highly regarded. These were considered religiously fastidious. Their piety was highly respected. You know, the Pharisees really came into prominence after the Babylonian exile, and they began to I guess, adhere to these elevated standards, of, washings and fastings and prayers and almsgiving. And they were really into these outward expressions of their faith. And it got people's attentions and it got a lot of people's respect. And not everybody was a Pharisee. It was like a quote unquote elite, kind of exclusive group of individuals. So for them making this act, making these accusations against Jesus, it could have been seen as damaging. And the reality is that, particularly as it relates to the Sabbath, the Sabbath was a particular place of offense as it relates to Israel, because why is it that they went into Babylonian captivity? Well, the prophets did point out it's because they were not observing the land Sabbath. They were not letting the land rest, and they went successive, years of not, practicing the year of Sabbath, the year of land rest, and that produced the Babylonian captivity. So this could be a particular serious area of contention. So what the Pharisees are essentially saying is that because these disciples, because they plucked this corn, in the process of plucking this corn, they would be harvesting, they would be threshing, and that they would be winnowing. Of course, harvesting is the grabbing of the corn, the threshing is the separating the wheat from the chaff, and then the winnowing is, of course, is letting the wind blow and separate it. So they're saying that you're doing work in doing this. So this is the dispute that they have with Jesus. But the challenge is, again, they're not being genuine in their accusation. The Pharisees had established some 39 categories of forbidden activity on the Sabbath, not 39 rules, 39 categories. So, there were additional. Now, there are already 613 rules in the Mosaic Law, and you're adding on top of that. That's very meticulous. That's very laborious. And the challenge is honestly, Scripture does give us latitude as believers to create standards for ourselves. That's necessary. The Bible says in Philippians 2:12, it says, work out your salvation, work out your own soul salvation with fear and trembling. You really should be careful as a believer to observe your walk and insulate yourself from things that would tempt you and lead you to ungodliness. That is appropriate. However, when you come up with these standards and you come up with this protocol, understand that some of these things are for you as an individual. And the challenge is that when these rabbis would teach these protocols as doctrine, when they would teach them as law, and Jesus would teach against that. He would teach against them elevating their own personal standards as law. So in Matthew chapter 7, verse number 7, it says, howbeit in vain do they worship me. It says, teaching for doctrine the commandments of man. And so he's saying, you can have a commandment, but don't teach it as doctrine, because otherwise you make people's worship vain. And that's true even today. Some people take a lot of pride in personal standards, and somehow they think that these personal standards make them better than other people. It's like, no. If there's any anointing in our lives, if there's any power at work in our lives, it's all made possible by the grace of God. It is according to the goodness of God. It is according to the sovereignty of God. So we are doing everything we can to glorify him and to please him and to make it in, because straight is the gate and narrow is the pathway that leads to everlasting life. But at the same time, we're not going to hang our ego on this stuff and start looking down on other people. So the Pharisees were not legitimately concerned. They were just really concerned about their influence. They were concerned about the fact that Jesus might be taking, some of their platform. And this became very explicitly highlighted in John chapter 11, verse number 48. It says, this is something that the Pharisees and scribes said. They says, if we let him thus alone, him being Jesus, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. So look, listen at how they're talking about Israel. It's our nation. And listen how they're talking about ministry. It's our place. That's what they were concerned about at the end of the day. They were concerned about their place and their influence with Israel. So then you would read in Mark chapter 3, verse number 6, it says, and the Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians. Get that, the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. Of course, him being Jesus. So here they are plotting and they're strategizing, not with other believers, No, they didn't take counsel with the Sanhedrin. They didn't take counsel, with other people of biblical Palestine or anything like that. No, they took counsel with the Herodians, which represent the politicians that were in allegiance with Herod, and they were trying to figure out, how can we get rid of this guy? Again, it was all about influence. These were not righteous motives. Okay, so how did Jesus respond? Verses 3 and 4, it says, "But he said unto them, have you not read what David did when he was a hungered?" There's that word hungry again. "And they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests." Okay, now Jesus is getting ready to engage in a series of arguments. He's going to make 3 arguments to in a sense defend the activity of the disciples. So this first argument that Jesus is making, it can be read in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1-6, where he's leaning on King David, and this is where you might get into this whole philosophical debate about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And essentially what happened is David, being on the run from King Saul, who was trying to essentially take his life because of jealousy, came into the land of Nob, and there was a priest that was serving there by the name of Ahimelech, and they were hungry. They didn't have any food, so David asked them to take the showbread that was in the temple, of course, that was reserved for the priest. According to the Mosaic law, in Leviticus 24:9, this was only for the priest. It was not for people, just the laity, common people. It was only for them. And that's what Jesus is talking about here in verse number 4, where it says they ate, which is not lawful for them to eat, but they ended up eating it. Why? Because David went to Ahimelech and he asked him to give it, and Ahimelech, in a sense, recognizing that David was God's anointed and that he was anointed to be king, but even though he was not king yet, he simply just asked David. He was like, have your men abstained from women at least for 3 days? And they said yes. So that he allowed them to eat. Now this represents a deviation from the letter of the law, and that's what Jesus is highlighting. What the disciples in the Pharisees' eyes may be a deviation from the letter of the law, even though it really wasn't that. But he's like, look at David, for example. But understand this: Jesus is doing so much more than simply using David as as an example. He's essentially equating himself to David. This is the subtlety of Jesus' teaching. This is the subtlety of Jesus's arguments in his conversation. In other words, Jesus is saying, just like David is a king, guess what? I'm a king as well. And just like David showed up with his men and was able to, in a sense, act in the authority of one who is Lord, he's saying, I'm acting in authority. So this is something that would not be lost on the Pharisees. Why? Because of course it was prophesied, and it's recorded in the book of Samuel, that the Messiah that would come through the line of David, that the line of David be established forever. So here it is. Jesus is making a very clear reference to David and his own authority. Again, we're talking about Lord of the Sabbath. So this is the first argument that Jesus is making. Okay, so let's make it to the next one. Verses 5 and 6, it says, "Or have ye not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple." Okay, so there's a couple things going on in these verses. First of all, Jesus is making his second argument, and he's talking about how the priests profane. That word profane, it means to desecrate. It means to, in a sense, he's saying that the priests are working on the Sabbath day because they're priests. Somebody has to facilitate the worship experience. Somebody has to serve. Somebody has to do the work of ministry And in a sense, he's saying that they are blameless. Why? Because it has to be done. And Jesus, again, is equating the disciples and himself to priests, or the work of ministry. He's saying, in a sense, that just like by them serving God, they're allowed to do work. He's saying we are as well. Now, there's a caveat to this, and this is a side note. I want to highlight the fact that what Jesus is showing very clearly here, that doing ministry, it is work. It is work. And we in Western culture here in America, I feel like we have a very strong work culture, very laborious. And my concern for a lot of believers is, for people that volunteer at church on the weekends and things like that. I want to encourage and admonish people to make sure that your volunteering is just that. It is volunteering. Like, of course, support the local ministry. That is so necessary and it's so good. But we have to be careful, because I've personally witnessed, and I've even been guilty of this myself, and I've had to, kind of like dial it back. Sometimes you can work so hard on the weekend that you work just as hard as you do during the week, or you work even more. And this is showing us very clearly that the work of ministry is in fact that, and we have to be careful. We have to be careful to Sabbath. Because if you're already working a 9 to 5 and then you're volunteering at your church on the weekend, when did you rest? Because while I do agree that Sabbath, it is a spiritual thing in the sense that you take the time to observe and appreciate what God has done in your life, Sabbath is also very natural. There's countless studies and research out there that shows the benefits of rest, and particularly taking a day of rest. That allows your emotions to settle down. It's good for your mental health, for your psychology, for your inner work. It's good for your physical body. I wish I had time to just really talk about the physiological benefits of just being still. And when I say rest, I'm talking about getting extra sleep. I'm talking about, because that what happens with a lot of us, particularly in contemporary culture, we start to do chores on Sunday, and we try to use that as a day to catch up on stuff. The Sabbath is a gift, and it is an expression of faith. And Jesus is showing us very clear right here that the work of ministry is taxing as well. So you're already doing a 9 to 5 and you're taxing. And many of us, we have families, we have little ones that we have to look after. And it just seems like you just never have a still moment. Be good to yourselves. That's all I'm saying in all of this. I'm not trying to attack anybody or anything like that. I'm trying to tell you what God gave me according to his word. The Sabbath is a gift. Be good to yourself. So Jesus is correlating the work of the disciples to the work that the priest did in the temple. And then he takes it a step further and he says that there's one greater than the temple. And of course, who is he talking about? He's talking about himself. And he is literally talking about that he is the temple. He is acknowledging the fact that he is the place where deliverance takes place. He is the place where worship takes place. He is not only the provider, the authority of Sabbath, but he is the facilitator of Sabbath. And I think that is so amazing. Jesus would talk about how you destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll build it again. But then the writer of Hebrews would go on in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11, it says, but Christ being come a high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands. That is to say, not of this building. So the writer of Hebrews will go on to say that Jesus was a greater and more perfect tabernacle. Why? Because he was the perfect sacrifice. Again, you cannot separate Jesus being the Sabbath in the fact that Jesus is our means of salvation. It always goes back to that. It always goes back to atonement. It always goes back to propitiation. We can find rest. All that work that the temple priests would normally do in offering sacrifices on a daily basis, as oblations to God, sin offerings, all of this work that they would do in order to facilitate temple work, very laborious, very physically intensive. Jesus was saying, you can rest from that. That is a beautiful thing. I mean, imagine going your whole life working so intently, so intense, and then all of a sudden somebody says, you can rest now. You'd be grateful. You would be so appreciative of somebody taking all that work off your hands. So that was argument number 2. Now finally argument number 3. In verse number 7, it says, but if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would have not condemned the guiltless. So this concept of have mercy is it's lending, or he says if you had known the law, in a sense, he's saying, referring back to Hosea, really, Hosea, uh, just the whole concept of Hosea being a prophet that was instructed to marry a harlot. That the whole book was a homage to the mercy of God. It was an illustration how Israel and the people of God, we as a people of God, are oftentimes unfaithful when God is faithful. God is faithful to the faithfuless, and that faithfulness of God is an act of mercy. It is an act of grace. Because understand, by definition, the word mercy, it means kindness or goodwill toward the miserable and afflicted. It means joined with a desire to relieve them. So, in other words, Jesus is saying, when you are looking for mercy, or when you will have mercy and not sacrifice, Jesus is saying that, really along the lines of what Paul was saying, that that if you serve without love, then you're really not serving. He's saying, as believers, we ought to look for opportunities to extend mercy and not an opportunity to try to hold somebody's feet to the fire. Some people seem like they just have a call out ministry. They feel like they want to just highlight the wrong that everybody else is doing and just really make them feel bad and look bad. And Jesus is like, no, as a believer, we ought to be looking for opportunities to extend mercy. So just like, Paul was saying, like, if you operate in ministry and you're not operating in love, you're not really ministering. Jesus is saying, look, if you're not operating in mercy, you're really not operating in ministry at all. Don't look for an opportunity to accuse, but look for an opportunity to cover. And he's saying, even at the end of the day, he's saying you're trying to condemn the guiltless. And of course, guiltless, he's talking about the disciples. He's saying that they're innocent. He's saying that if they are hungry, in accordance to the Mosaic law, they're allowed to glean. But then number 2, these additional rules that you have elevated on top of the Mosaic law, listen, they are not requirements for salvation. These guys are innocent. So that was Jesus's 3 arguments. Then, of course, he just concludes it with this emphatic statement. It says, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So he's saying, first of all, he's Lord, which he's saying that he is God. But then also he's saying that, and included in that is the Sabbath day. Now, of course, Jesus would refer to himself as Son of Man so many times over the course of his ministry. And that is referenced back to Daniel chapter 7, the prophecy of Daniel, with this vision of the Son of Man coming out of heaven with the, under the authority of the Ancient of Days, and how he would have dominion and glory, and he would be king over the nations and different things like that. When Jesus would make this reference, he is referring to this messianic prophecy. And of course, when he calls himself Lord, a Lord is one who has the possession of a thing and has the authority over it, the ability to dictate what a thing is and what it does. I've got the definition of that in the notes. Definitely download those so that they can help give you more understanding of it. But a Lord in the Greek is Kyrios. It is the possessor and the disposer of a thing. It is the master. It is the one who is able to determine what is suitable and appropriate, even for the as it relates to the Sabbath. You know, but of course, this word "kurios" is the Greek version, and it could be applied to, of course, the Messiah. It could be applied to Jesus, but technically, the word Lord could be applied to anybody who is a possessor of something or a person of great status. So, from a Hebrew standpoint, the word Lord would be the Tetragrammaton, which would be Yahweh, which would be the unspoken name of God. So when we look at it from that lens, Jesus saying that the Son of Man is Lord, he's saying that Jesus is God. So that is an extremely powerful statement. And of course, these are further further statements that Jesus makes that really frustrates the Pharisees and the scribes, because at first he's declaring people, for their sins are forgiven. They're like, who can declare people's sins forgiven except God? And now he's in fact calling himself God. So it's with things like this that they're saying, oh, he's blaspheming. He calls himself God, and they're trying to take issue with it. But listen, it's to no avail. So in conclusion, we want to talk about the lordship of Jesus is really the point of consternation for these Pharisees. But the reality is that Jesus fulfills the Sabbath, and it's that through this that we are seeing that concept very heavily illustrated in today's passage. This means so much for us, again, as New Testament believers. Because, as Paul would write in Colossians, we as New Testament believers, we are not obligated to adhere to the different elements of the Mosaic law that relates to the Sabbath. There were multiple Sabbaths. As much as people talk about just the one day a week, and trying to argue and debate, well, which day is a Sabbath? Is it Saturday? Is it Sunday? And different things like that. The reality is that the Mosaic law had several Sabbaths written into it. We talked about the land Sabbath, that would happen every 7 years. And then, of course, in the year of Jubilee, you would have the extended land Sabbath. So it's just like there was so much, during the different feasts, like Feast of Tabernacles, there were several Sabbaths interwoven inside that celebration. So Jesus has simplified it all for us. We can have rest in him. He's Lord of the Sabbath. He is our Sabbath. And it's through him that we have salvation. And it's through him that we get our direction. So listen, that's our lesson for today. I hope something was said that can encourage you along the way. As always, we'll be back next week, same time, same place. Until then, we love you with the love of the Lord.